1. The plurality and duality of civilizations. Recently, in contrast to the notion of progress and the idea that history has been represented as the more or less continuous upward evolution of collective humanity, the idea of a plurality of the forms of civilization and of a relative incommunicability between them has been confirmed. According to this second and new version of history, civilization breaks down into epochs and disconnected cycles. At a given moment and within a given race, a specific conception of the world and of life is affirmed, from which follows a specific system of truths, principles, understandings, and realizations. A civilization springs up, gradually reaches a culminating point, and then falls into darkness and, more often than not, disappears. A cycle has ended. Perhaps another will rise again some day, somewhere else. Perhaps it may even take up the concerns of preceding civilizations, but any connection between them will be strictly analogical. The transition from one cycle of civilization to another, one completely alien to the other, implies a jump, which in mathematics is called a discontinuity. Although this view is a healthy reaction to the superstition of history as progress, which came into fashion more or less at the same time as materialism and Western scientism, nevertheless, we should be cautious, for in addition to a plurality of civilizations, we have to recognize a duality, especially when we limit ourselves to those times and essential structures that we can embrace with some measure of certainty. Modern civilization stands on one side, and on the other the entirety of all the civilizations that have preceded it. For the West, we can put the dividing line at the end of the Middle Ages. At this point, the rupture is complete. Apart from the multitudinous variety of its forms, pre-modern civilization, which we may as well call traditional, means something quite different. For there are two worlds, one of which has separated itself by cutting off nearly every contact with the past. For the great majority of moderns, that means any possibility of understanding the traditional world has been completely lost. This premise is indispensable for the examination of our subject. The Hermetico-alchemical tradition forms part of the cycle of pre-modern traditional civilization, and in order to understand its spirit, we need to translate it inwardly from one world to the other. Who undertakes this study without having acquired the ability to rise above the modern mindset, or who has not awakened to a new sensitivity that can place itself in contact with the general spiritual stream that gave life to the tradition in the first place, will succeed only in filling his head with words, symbols, and fantastic allegories. Moreover, it is not just a question of intellectual understanding. We have to bear in mind that ancient man not only had a different way of thinking and feeling, but also a different way of perceiving and knowing. The heart of the matter that will concern us is to re-evoke, by means of an actual transformation of the consciousness, this older basis of understanding and action. Only then will the unexpected light of certain expressions dawn on us, and certain symbols be empowered to awaken our interior perception. Only then will we be conducted through them to new heights of human realization, and to the understanding that will make it possible for designated rites to confer magical and operant power, and for the creation of a new science that bears no resemblance to anything that goes by that name today. 2. Living nature. The fundamental issue in our study is the human experience of nature. The average modern man's relationship with nature is not the one that prevailed in the pre-modern cycle, to which, along with many other traditions, the Hermetico-alchemical tradition belongs. The study of nature today devotes itself exhaustively to a conglomeration of strictly reasoned laws concerning various phenomena, light, electricity, heat, etc., which spread out kaleidoscopically before us, utterly devoid of any spiritual meaning, derived solely from mathematical processes. In the traditional world, on the contrary, nature was not thought about, but lived, as though it were a great, sacred, animated body, the visible expression of the invisible. Knowledge about nature derived from inspiration, intuition, and visions, and was transmitted by initiation as so many living mysteries referring to things that today have lost their meaning and seem banal and commonplace, as, for example, the art of building, medicine, cultivation of the soil, and so forth. Myth was not an arbitrary or fantastic notion. It arose from a necessary process in which the same forces that shaped things acted upon the plastic faculty of the imagination, unfettered by the bodily senses, to dramatize themselves in images and figures that were woven into the tapestry of sensory experience, and resulted finally in a significance of moment. Universe, hear my plea. Earth, open. Let the waters open for me. Trees, do not tremble. Let the heavens open and the winds be silent. Let all my faculties celebrate in me the All in One. These are the words of a hymn that the sons of Hermes recited at the beginning of their sacred operations. Such was the height to which they were capable of elevating themselves. The following is an even more emphatic version. The gates of heaven are open, the gates of earth are open, the way of the current is open. My spirit has been heard by all the gods and genii, by the spirit of heaven and earth, the sea and the currents. And such is the teaching of the Corpus Hermeticum. Rise up above every height, descend deeper than any depth. Concentrate into thyself all the sensations of created things, of water, fire, dry and wet. Think of finding yourself simultaneously everywhere, in the earth, sea, or sky. Think of having never been born, of still being an embryo, young and old, dead and beyond death. Embrace everything at the same time, all times, places, things, qualities, and quantities. These possibilities of perception and communication, this aptitude for connections, despite what we believe today, were not fantasies, wild superstitions, or extravagant exaggerations. On the contrary, they were part of an experience as real as that of physical things. More precisely, the spiritual constitution of the man of traditional civilizations was such that any physical perception had simultaneously a psychic component which animated it, adding to the naked image a meaning, and at the same time a special and powerful emotional overtone. This is how ancient physics could be both a theology and a transcendental psychology. It derived from quite universal metaphysical essences, primarily from the superconscious world, in sudden flashes of light wherein matter was provided by the sense organs. Natural science was a corollary spiritual science, and the many meanings of its symbols reflected different aspects of a single knowledge. 3. The Hermetic knowledge. It is on the above basis that we have to understand the whole idea of the hermetico-alchemical science. In a certain sense, it can also be called a natural science, but completely disregarding all the present connotations such a term may evoke in our mind. Today, the medieval designation of natural philosophy expresses rather the synthesis of two elements, now standing on two separate planes, one intellectually unrealistic, philosophy, and the other consciously materialistic, science. But given the character of organic unity, of a cosmos, that the universe offered to traditional man, there was also an implicit anagogical power in the natural understanding, namely, the possibility of rising to a transcendent metaphysical plane. On this basis are to be understood such expressions as hierarchic mystery, divine work, appearing with the origins of alchemy, and which are preserved within the entire tradition of what Zacharias would call divine and supernatural science. And as psychic sensitivity to the deep forces of nature began to dwindle in later eras, it became common to avoid the ambiguity in the expressions of the Hermetic tradition by distinguishing between the vulgar or dead elements and the living ones, which are our elements. The our refers to those who had preserved the original spiritual state of the tradition, our water, our fire, our mercury, etc., not those of the vulgar or common, a jargon for referring to the elements that were physically invisible, occult, magical, known only to the wise, those of us who have kept in our hands those elements of creation that must be recognized by us as distinct from the earthy, impure, created elements that are merely the modifications of physical matter. The four elements in which all things participate, says Flamel, are not apparent to the senses, but are known by their effects. Air and fire, of which Bernard of Treviso speaks, are tenuous and spiritual, and cannot be seen by physical eyes. His sulphur, arsenic, and mercury are not those that the vulgar think them to be, or that pharmacists sell, but they are the philosopher's spirit. So philosophical alchemy is that which teaches how to investigate, not by appearances, but according to concrete truth, the latent forms, in an Aristotelian sense, the occult formative principles of things. An idea confirmed by Razi in the Lumen Luminum. This art is the study of occult philosophy. In order to follow it, one must be acquainted with hidden and internal natures. In it, one speaks of the rise, incorporeal state, and fall, visible state, of the elements and their compounds. The true elements are as the soul of the mixtures, the others are nothing but the body, explains Pernetti. And if the spontaneous presence or absence of the necessary metaphysical sensitivity itself determined the dividing line between those initiates to whom alone the texts speak, and for whom the techniques of the royal art bear fruition, and those who are not initiates, for whom it is written not to cast pearls before swine, for these last there still remain the possibility of attaining the necessary state by means of an appropriate asceticism, even if the miracle of illumination was missing. We shall discuss this asceticism later, but for the moment we shall confine ourselves to pointing out that, within the framework of Hermeticism, asceticism does not have a moral or religious justification. It is simply a technique. Its purpose is to provide an experience that is not limited to the dead or common aspect of the elements, as happens in the empiricism on which the modern profane sciences are based. Instead, a subtle, incorporeal, spiritual quality infuses it. Paracelsus describes this quality in this way: she, nature, knows me, and I her. I have contemplated the light that is in her. I have verified it in the microcosm, and I have found it again in the macrocosm. As is said in the Hermetic Triumph, to know the inner and outward properties of all things, and to penetrate to the bottom of nature's operations, is the condition that is imposed on whomever aspires to possess this knowledge. And so it can be said that who does not understand by himself, no one will ever be able to make understand, do what he will. This science is not acquired through books or reason, others affirm, but by action, by an impetuosity of the spirit. For this reason I declare that neither the philosophers who have preceded me, nor I myself, have written anything except for ourselves. Nisi solis nobis scripissimus, for the philosophers, our successors, and for no one else.